Okay, let's look now at the degree of rivalry. Rivalry is the first of the 5 forces that I want to discuss that relates to how that pie is carved up. So we've talked about value creation. Now we're going to think about the value that's captured by the incumbents in an industry. And the question here that is raised in the article is, do the structural conditions create the potential for market power among the firms in a business? Let me just say a word about market power here. Market power runs on a spectrum opposite to rivalry. So, we've got situations that are quite famous of very low rivalry that involve very high market power. Such as, for example, allegedly, I suppose I should say, De Beers in the diamond industry here. They really, for years, were a virtual monopolist in the diamond mining business, the business of mining diamonds, fine diamonds that would be used, for example, in engagement rings here. In fact, the European Union accused De Beers of actually collusion at one point. Vertical restraints on trade and so on here. At its very limit, very high market power can involve collusion, which of course is illegal in most jurisdictions here. Rivalry doesn't have to be that low for us to consider that it's low. Market power doesn't have to be that high here. We've got examples that will come up in the curriculum of relatively high market power situations, such as Coke and Pepsi in the concentrate production business. Even motorcycle manufacturers, there's probably 10 or so of them that are majors. They're associated with particular segments of motorcycles, such as sports motorcycles versus cruisers versus speed motorcycles. They're associated with different geographies here. So you've got specialization by the motorcycles across the globe in terms of their product orientations. All of those are conditions that make for relatively low rivalry. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, there's very high rivalry in, for example, the airline industry. This airline industry is famous for having incredibly low market power. As soon as somebody figures out how to make money in a particular route pair, somebody flies in a plane and seems to contest that value. And this has been complicit in some of the losses that have occurred over time in the airline industry. Most high rivalry industries, though, don't deliver a negative return that's below zero in their, across all rivals here. Most just deliver a return that's less than that economic average that I described. So remember, I told you earlier that the average in the economy on return on assets right now is about 4%. Most high rivalry industries will generate a return between 0% and that 4%. For example, in the operation of cafes around the world, a very fragmented industry that Starbucks entered some years ago with great success, the average return on assets in that business is pretty low. It's estimated to be between 1% and 2% in North America here. So it's not in negative territory, it's just very low. I want to say something very important here about rivalry, which is that in an industry that has high profits, such as Coke, Pepsi, such as the motorcycle industry, it's economically impossible for rivalry to be high. By definition, rivalry is low in these contexts. We're going to define rivalry relative to industry average profits. These are situations where rivalry by definition is low. So we're using the analysis of rivalry to try to ask this question or address this question: what is it that's creating this market power among firms in the business? Now, Porter gives you a list. He says what will drive relatively low rivalry are things like there's few competitors in the business that are well balanced. Coke and Pepsi are the classical example. Two companies that have been competing against each other for over 100 years. They know each other. They're well balanced in that business, and between them, they have something like 76% market share. So that's an example of industries that are of an industry, the concentrate production industry, where there's only a very few competitors that are well balanced here. You know, industry growth, it turns out, is a complicated thing. What really matters to keep rivalry low is not necessarily the level of growth, but its volatility. You know, there are some low growth businesses that actually have very low rivalry in them. You can think of, for example, today, baby foods. What are some low growth industries that are relatively stable, you know, and are generating high profits? I mentioned the beer business earlier. You know, a lot of old staid health and beauty categories, such as the provision of shampoo, might be in this category, for example. Okay, what really kills rivalry and gets companies into competition that dissipates industry average profits is volatility. And the reason why is because in good times, when your revenues are relatively high, you chase capacity and you build out to be able to compete at that level into the future. And then if you hit a down year, you don't know what your problem is. You don't know if your problem is temporary, in which case you should potentially keep your prices relatively stable and sort of wait out the problems, or whether or not you're losing market share to your rivals. It's very difficult to manage pricing strategies and other aspects of competition where there's a lot of volatility, a lot of shifting of market share, and so on between companies over time. So industry growth is maybe a mixed bag. What really matters is volatility. Scale and learning economies tend to create less rivalry because you have to be big and have a lot of learning in order to be successful. It's not worth it to try to compete on at a low scale, or to try to steal scale and learning from a competitor because it's so difficult to achieve economically. If everybody's got a niche, such as in motorcycles, you know, Harley Davidson associated with cruisers, Ducati associated with sports motorcycles, and so on, everybody's got their geography. That'll tend to dampen rivalry. If it's hard to switch for buyers and suppliers, that'll dampen rivalry. And if you know that corporations are going to fight to the death to protect their positions, that dampens rivalry for sure. Now, you can think of things that are not on this list that could also create market power, like I got a patent. You can't come into my area because I have a patent on a particular technology, or I have access to raw materials that nobody else can get, or I have some sort of a favorable legislative environment that's going to favor me as an incumbent and not allow other companies to compete against me effectively. All of these are things that would be relevant to the degree of rivalry. So the key is to look in the particular industry that you're studying as the subject of your industry analysis and ask, okay, what are the conditions of market power?